Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's briefing at the Jerusalem Press Club ahead of International Women's Day. I'm Talia Deckel-Fleissig, CEO of JPC. 5 months after October 7th, our nation continues to fight terror on multiple fronts. Our soldiers continue to die and are wounded in battle. Our hostages remain in captivity, and others who have returned begin to rebuild their lives. We still mourn our victims, and over 100,000 Israelis are still displaced. For all of these reasons, it is crucial for our resilience that we celebrate the heroes of this period and make sure their stories are known to the public. A timely report issued this week by UN Commission found what Israelis have known all along about the gravity and nature of the sexual horrors committed against children, women, and men during the Hamas rampage. However, in today's event, we wish to shine a light on examples of women who are helping those most affected by the war and are still among the living. We are so honored to host Dr. Naama Fontaine, Clinical Director at Sheba Medical Center and Head of Child Trauma and Adolescent Center at the hospital. Dr. Fontaine, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to speak with us.
Sure. May I start by correcting my position?
Please, go ahead.
Yeah. Yes. So I am the head of the Trauma, Child and Adolescent Outpatient Clinic here, not the department.
Oh,
yes.
The outpatient clinic. Okay, thank you for the correction. Thank you.
Yeah.
So your center was at the forefront of treating hostages returning to Israel as part of the ceasefire deal in November, mostly children and women who were released. Could you share some of your personal experiences with our viewers, how you prepared your team, what actually occurred in the field, and really what it felt like to be part of such an historic occasion?
Yes, sure. So I have to say that the preparation for receiving the hostages started very early. It started long before we had any real, confirmation that they would be released and that we would receive them. So we're preparing under a condition of, of the unknown. And I think that that is really noteworthy that that the Sheba Hospital allowed itself to begin preparations even before knowing that we would have the chance to implement them. And preparations started with just first gathering our experts in adult and child psychology, psychiatry, trauma experts, medicine, social work, really a multidisciplinary team of experts coming together to, just start in recognition of what has just occurred and what the task might be at hand. And we started with, I think for us personally, our team started with what we always do in these sort of situations, which is, what do we already know? Because the feeling was, and continues to be, that this is unprecedented for several reasons: the magnitude, the surprise element, the horrific events, the just the unknown conditions of hostages. This is not an organized organization where we know where they are and what they're exposed to. We really don't know and there's quite a variety in the age range to start with, babies all the way to elderly have been kidnapped and taken into unknown conditions, different circumstances. And so we're faced with a situation with many unknown variables, and we have to prepare for sort of a mass casualty event. So we start with what we know. We go back to the principles that we know, we go back to the literature, to other situations like this around the world, and we really found that we won't find the answers outside, that there's not anything that quite fits this situation and that would give us all the answers, definitely. So we sat together to create the protocol. That's the first step. And in doing so, we use the knowledge that we have on trauma, child trauma, parent-child trauma, and child development and medicine, and taken everything together. And this is why it was so crucial to have such a multidisciplinary team. Taken everything together, we started creating the flow, the first steps of how we would receive them, what we might expect to see, how we could best respond in the first encounter, in the first moments and hours, all the way through their stay at the hospital, and helping them with discharge and planning ahead, knowing very well that they would need support throughout. So that's where we started, just tackling those unknowns and trying to fill in the gaps with the knowledge that we do have, and with a great deal of flexibility. And because of all the variability and the unknowns, we really also prepared for not being prepared.
And the execution, how did it play out? What you can discuss, obviously.
So, the execution involved, first of all, creating teams of psychosocial teams of a social worker and a psychologist that were invested in helping the families waiting for the returnees, spending the hours, sometimes, with the first release, the group that was released to Sheba, actually we spent hours waiting for them, and it was unclear whether they would actually be released. So escorting and supporting the families, waiting for them at Sheba was a crucial part of it. And then receiving them, and every team of social worker and psychologist also had a supervising psychiatrist, a doctor to consult with. There were also experts in gynecology and forensics available on call, nurses, and so on. So, and also in the selection of the hospital unit in which we would have the returnees and their families stay. So the choice was to have them stay at the Safra Children's Hospital, in a department that we can control their privacy, with a great deal of well-intentioned visitors and media. And the entire country is looking at these people and have been praying for their return, but they need their privacy, and they need to have the time with their families. So we chose a department that would allow us to shelter them from the overwhelming information and stimulation that was maybe waiting for them. And even the rooms, each and every room was chosen carefully, and we brought in blankets and pajamas and slippers and toys for the children, and anything that would feel less like a hospital stay and more like, coming home. And that being said, we also had everything that a hospital could provide, because we really didn't know in what condition they would come to us. So it was really creating layers of support, layers of, the psychosocial team and the rooms that feel like home, but also having a layer of acute care and medicine and everything else that might be required.
Right. So you really didn't have any previous information or knowledge about what condition you would receive them. So you would have had to be prepared for anything, really. You mentioned in a briefing in Hebrew last week.
Sorry, Talia, I didn't mention a important part of our training was through the Sheba Simulation Center, where we had live simulations with professional actors who played out scenarios that might occur with hostages because of all these unknowns. So those scenarios were created by the team of experts here, trauma experts at Sheba, both adults and children, and were based upon, the information that we had from October 7th, knowing what survivors have been exposed to, recognizing what hostages might have been exposed to, including, for example, being forcefully separated from their caretakers for children, from their families, not knowing what happened to their families, having to receive terrible news including death notifications upon their arrival. So taking into consideration what we could imagine and what we could predict, they created scenarios, and the actors embodied, these hostages returning. And it gave us a chance to practice our protocols, to hone our skills, to enhance our collaborative work, our multidisciplinary work, which we do on a regular basis, but this is in acute situations, and we're paired with professionals who we might know or we might have never worked with together. So it allowed us to really work through the protocols and exact them in a situation where you're allowed to make mistakes, and it also, I think, prepared us emotionally. So you asked about that. It really helped us walk in our own shoes before having to do the real thing. And it was very emotional also, that the trainings were emotional as well, because, we are also affected. We're affected clinicians and professionals, and this
And
was,
you're human too, so.
and we're human, and it's very close to home and close to heart. So it allowed us to also create, build our resiliency and our capacity.
Could you expand a little bit about that, how you prepared your team? And if we're already talking about International Women's Day, did you see any difference maybe in the way that your male staff versus your female staff handle these situations?
Well, I think are 95, or I don't know the exact number, percent women in the field here. So we are a majority of women, and this is in and of itself empowering a profession that is the majority of which is women, and is absolutely necessary, and was given a great deal of room here at Sheba. I think that this building the protocol, exacting it, and implementing it was led by the director of the the Safra Children's Hospital, Professor Itai Pesach, and he definitely recognized the importance of the psychosocial teams, and gave so much room for consultation and leadership from that perspective. And I think it made a huge difference in terms of, recognizing, like I said, even the need for the rooms to be very child-oriented or very sensitive to what they had gone through in captivity, including the possibility of sexual abuse, and all those things taken into account. I think they're not just female, they're part of the profession in general, and being aware of that. So I can't really compare, it's mostly women, but I will say that the teams that were chosen were also, when there was a choice, sometimes we leaned towards having women because of the unknown exposures, and because of what we did know regarding the possibility. So when we're working with traumatized survivors, we are well aware of the possibility of, gender or circumstances, exposures being triggering. So knowing that, the offenders were men, and it was very important for us to create an environment in which, we wouldn't risk returnees feeling threatened or triggered in any way.
Is this regardless of whether the victim, him or herself, is male or female? In
Yes.
both cases.
Yes, I think so. We know that a survival strategy for us with trauma is to overgeneralize. So if the offender is male, then, that might in itself be triggering. In the same token, we also kept, we had security, we have military personnel here, and we made sure not to have weapons on the unit, visible on the unit in any way, because that could be very triggering, right? So there was also a conscious decision to have female teams. And that being said, it is really important that trauma survivors, especially those who have experienced the trauma at the hands of a male, be exposed to, men who can help them heal and reestablish trust in all the, wonderful and well-intentioned and good male professionals that we have on our team. So,
Of course. One journalist from Le Monde is actually asking if you're able to share what kinds of trauma the hostages that you met with were exposed to, of course, without naming names, but if there's a way that you can expand a little bit about their stories.
right. So as you said, protecting their privacy as best possible, I could just say that there was a vast array of trauma and exposure. And I think that just what we know, being violently torn from your home, from your family members, you can imagine what they've been exposed to on the way out, what they had seen, and taking into unknown territory, being exposed to so much violence on the way there, and then going, and then day in, day out, not knowing what they're about to be exposed to, when this will end, who is fighting for them, if some were really secluded and didn't know. And I think you can imagine just the array and the diverse traumatic experiences, psychological, emotional, physical, and otherwise. So I think everything.
Okay, we can leave it at that.
Yeah.
Of course, there are other populations affected by the war. We discussed them at the beginning, and we can assume that they're coming in for treatment as well. These other populations, can you tell us a little bit about your team's work with these other groups?
Absolutely. So we started thinking and working towards providing an emotional, psychological, and psychiatric response in, the next day. October 8th, I think, was our first meeting. If not, on the 7th, we were already talking and thinking about outreach and how to best help the populations in need. And, there are those exposed directly, those who were present during the attack, affected directly as witnesses, and so on. And then there are circles and, just more populations that are exposed indirectly, including, of course, the families that have been evacuated. They're also part of the direct exposure. And we had teams from Sheba who went out to the hotels to which they were evacuated and provide everything from psychological first aid, parent support, groups, art therapy, and also system level interventions, because they were evacuated to hotels, and sometimes it was a great deal of chaos, as happens in disaster response. So people evacuated to hotels, but having no plan or no structure, and then you have acute stress and trauma reactions playing out in circumstances that are not organized, could really contribute to a sense of chaos and exacerbate anxiety symptoms and other behavioral reactions that we see with children. And so interventions in those hotels were also to help organize and create, regain a sense of control and counter that internal and external chaos that often happens with disasters.
What
So
what
that's
is the,
sort of
what is the
outreach.
treatment for that, though, to sum up the...
So it's a multi-level response, because you have the system level response that has to do with collaboration and helping. There are a lot of organizations that are all well-intentioned and are there to help, but you need to sort of make sure that they're synchronized in their response. And, just for example, creating a schedule, or sometimes turning off the lights in the lobby after 12 p.m. so that teenagers who are having, terrible sleep difficulties and are hypervigilant are not walking around the hotel at all hours of the night, but are actually going back to their rooms, where their parents, who might be devastated from what happened, can, step back into their roles as parents. So that's an example of a system level. But of course, there were also individual consultations and group sessions. So that's outside the hospital. But our teams went out. And then in addition to that, along with Sheba Beyond, we created a remote treatment, an immediate emergency remote treatment of about 4 sessions for parents and children affected in any way by the events. So that we had about 100 families reach out to us and request this treatment. And these were children who were affected by the ongoing threat, the disruption to their routine, the exposure to sirens, and rocket attacks, children who were afraid to sleep in their beds or go to school, or let their parent out of sight. So we provided psychological treatment to them. Yeah, I think those were some of the main, and that was the children's hospital, but the adult, we also have the adult department, and they also did the same thing, providing this remote treatment through Sheba Beyond, and also providing psychological care to the survivors of the Nova Dance Festival. And they had, approximately, I think, 600 people reach out in need of psychological support. So
Right.
those are some of the activities, yeah.
Right. People often underestimate the trauma of people just running from rockets and sirens, and we of course know of this awful incident in which a young girl was passed away after a heart event during one of the sirens. We're almost out of time, but we do have just a few last questions. We know that the circle of people needing post-traumatic treatment is growing and growing, first because of the sheer numbers of the initial attack, but also, of course, because of the continuing events of the war. And with your knowledge of the system, do you think that Israel is equipped to deal with this growing number of people who need treatment?
So I think the system in Israel is incredible in its understanding that there's an emergency, and the kind of organization that has happened, and the tremendous volunteer work and efforts that people have put in immediately after this event and ever since is it's really demonstrative of the resilience, and I think of the commitment of the professionals here, and I think the Israeli people in general, to take part. And in that sense, Sheba has been able to grow so quickly into creating these activities and providing help to soldiers and civilians and children. And that being said, we still need to work on it. We're still, the need is greater than what we have to offer. And that's because this is, a national level, if not international, but definitely a national level disaster. And we know that the consequences of exposure, as you said, it's not just the direct exposure. Of course, those directly traumatized need help and will need help going on. But it's also the various circles of exposure and we need to create trauma-informed systems so that we can recognize the children, for example, that are struggling in school long before they make their way to the psychiatric clinic. So we're working also on extending our reach beyond the hospital to help populations and help in prevention. So there's still work to be done there, and we're building. We're definitely committed to that.
That makes sense. Just one last question on the, what lies ahead in terms of hopefully the rest of the hostages being released. Of course, there's talk of a pending deal. Is that something that the hospital is preparing for? Although that we know that most of the hostages aren't children and young people, although there are a few, as we know. The majority are adults, so they won't be treated specifically in your clinic. But are there things that are being done, like conversations with colleagues to discuss best practices? And another question that came in that's related is, are you able to continue your day-to-day work knowing that this cloud hangs above, that there might be another release anytime, and you'll have to re-prepare yourselves for that as well?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think it goes to the question of, what is it like being an affected professional yourself? And, and I think you asked me before, what are we doing to help our teams, cope and prepare? And I think it goes hand in hand, because the answer to the first question is that I think that we're on alert. We're waiting. We're every minute of every day, we're waiting to hear good news. And I think that in that sense, we in no possible way have we let it go, or are we back to routine. We are on edge, and we are alert, and we are prepared. We are prepared for the unknown, because we don't know the conditions, we don't have any information. And so we're prepared for anything and whatever it takes. And at the same time, we don't want to lose sight of patients in need of routine care, who are an important part, who we can prevent the deterioration of their conditions. So we have to maintain, head above water, as we're also preparing to receive and hoping to receive more returnees. And going back to your first question, how we do that and how we try to maintain our resiliency, and it's a lot of, I think, caretaking within teams, and being aware of what our colleagues and what we are all going through. And it comes across in recognizing, we talked about women. So women whose partners are in the military, have been drafted now, and are still, and are left at home with the kids, and are still coming into work, every day to care for patients. So reaching out to them and making sure that they're okay. It's sometimes just saying to them, what are your plans for the weekend? Who's staying with you? Sending them care packages, which we've done, and saying to them that we're here for them throughout. So it's part of our preparation. So not letting go, not forgetting that we need to help people maintain resiliency over time. So those are some examples, I think, of us still waiting, and preparing.
I'll just ask one last question, because it's come in. Is the fact that there are still hostages in Gaza something that impacts the treatment of those who have returned? I'm not sure what, if they're still coming into the hospital for treatment as we speak. But the question is whether you see any sort of influence on the fact that there are still maybe loved ones in Gaza on your ability to treat the hostages, and how they're coping.
I think that if it affects us, who don't necessarily have our loved ones there, but this feeling of brothers and sisters who are there, and it affects us, then of course it would affect the families who have been ripped apart and are not complete. They're not complete, they're not whole until their loved ones come back. So I think we all feel that to some, to different extents, but we all feel it. Of course, this is part of the process of recovery and healing, is having this, the first step in healing trauma is recognizing that it's behind you and that it ended. So as long as it's not ended, it's ongoing, it's very difficult to start healing.
Very, very clear. And of course, I hope that you will be able to fulfill the next step, which is treating the remaining hostages once they're returned. Dr. Naama de la Fontaine, thank you so much for your time, and of course to your team, to everything that you're doing, and to Sheba Medical Center as well. And happy International Women's Day.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you to everyone.